Complicated things about the 1812 is why it happened at all.
Wow, that's a question.
It is. It's such a huge question. I wrote it down here that pretty much it ties in with the problem with Poland.
Yeah.
The inability to cement any meaningful alliance from Napoleon's side with Alexander, and the and pretty much the strain of the continental system being impossible to bear. Those are the three things I took away from my reading this week.
I think all those are valid. I think Poland, especially the Duchy of Warsaw, it's essentially a launching pad for any sort of invasion of Russia. And it's always been a problem in Russian foreign policy. Poland needs to be friendly, because if Poland is not friendly, then people who are unfriendly to us can do bad things from there. And I think I've read some geography stuff which said that it's Poland's like the narrowest point of the Grand Eurasian plain, and therefore it's easiest to basically put your line of defense there. And I think that makes quite a lot of sense. But yeah, certainly, I don't think any Russian monarch could have entertained the notion of a potentially hostile power.
Almost certainly hostile power.
Well, indeed, controlling Poland. And clearly the Poles were not particularly enamored. Well, I mean, I suppose,
there was some faction, but generally speaking, yes, they weren't terribly friendly to the Tsar.
Yes, I think most of the Poles were sort of Francophile rather than Prussophile or Russophile.
Well, the nobility of Poland was staunchly, the majority was staunchly in favor of basically Napoleon rather than Alexander.
And obviously, the Polish national anthem is the only national anthem to have Bonaparte in the words.
And I can see why. I can see why they had a much better deal with Napoleon than everybody else.
I mean, that's true. You can't rather maintain some sort of cohesion than be cut three ways and.
There's no doubt about it. On that score, they have a point.
The 19th century was not a good time to be Poland.
No, not of all the places to be nation-wise, Poland is one of the rockiest ones.
The other things you mentioned, so I think the continental system was clearly a factor in the outbreak of the war. The Russo-British trade was quite lucrative. For both sides, and especially Britain got a lot of the wood for its ships from Russia. So
yes, it's true. It's true. Weirdly enough, I was reading about the early Royal Navy, and in Samuel Pepys wrote in his treatise on the Navy, telling King James pretty much how to reform the Navy from the awful state it got into. He was saying the best timber is coming from Russia, basically. So
because they have massively tall trees.
Yeah, as far back as the 1680s and 90s, the Royal Navy was floating its ships with Russian and Eastern, certainly timber.
So clearly, for Britain it was important, and for Russia, a lot of trade in St. Petersburg was with the British, and the British were basically masters of the Baltic at this point, to some extent, and I think the Russian aristocracy. At least those based in Petersburg, were largely Anglophile as a result of the fact that they wanted to continue trading with Britain. And I think there would have been some sort of, you already had some sort of rumbles in the Russian court leading up to to 1812, I think. And Alexander did not want to suffer the fate of his father. Let's just put it that way.
And the least said about that in court circles, the better. To say the least, we probably don't have time to go into Tsar Alexander in this video, but there's some guilt issues there.
I think he spent most of his reign with that, very much
guilt and paranoia.
yeah. Talk about a sword of Damocles. And that's also one of the reasons why in 1812 he couldn't just say, let's just retreat all the way and never fight Napoleon, because at some point you're going to have everyone basically coming out the palace door saying, what the hell are you doing?
Grand Duke Constantine is still alive,
The thing is, I don't think it would have been, because there were a lot of people saying, championing the cause of Grand Duchess Catherine, who was basically the leader of the conservative circle and was involved in some sense with Bagration.
Oh yes, I remember now. Good grief, yes. When I read that, I was what?
I mean, that's kind of why why Bagration ended up marrying a woman who sort of ended up cheating on him very quickly. It was because Bagration was having dalliances with the Grand Duchess, and Tsar Paul, who was still around at the time, basically sort of said, I don't like the look of this, and basically set Bagration and Catherine Skwaronskaya or something, and basically set them up, like it was pretty much the first time they met, at a ball, and I said, well, you seem to get on well.
Straight out of War and Peace. It's Pierre's betrothal night. Where he just walks in and puts their hands together.
yeah, exactly. The marriage did not go well.
Surprisingly.
Well, indeed. But and obviously Catherine Bagration, ended up having a whale of a time in Vienna.
Oh yes, indeed. She got around. It's apparent. Just what shall I do now? Where are all the best people? Vienna, I'll go to Vienna.
Especially now I'm a widow.
Yes, that's an excellent ground to go to. I think after at that period, Belgium, Brussels, and Vienna and Paris were the three places you would send your daughters.
Or not, as it may be.
Well, in those days, if you wanted them married off, Jimmy, if you were the father and you had some. You've been at war for over 10 years. The marriage pool's dried up.
That is very true.
All the officers are at war.
All the officers are either at war or essentially at war, but over a negotiating table.
Yes, and that's so you have to go where the fish are. And so those things were just coupled with Napoleon's complete inability to keep an alliance together for 5 minutes. Just spiraled into a war, which he said he didn't want, and to be honest with you, I believe it. I believe that.
No one really wanted it, but
no, nobody wanted it. I mean, for heaven's sake, the last thing anybody in Europe wanted was Russia to go to war with France.
But both sides were at fault to some extent, because it's not like Russia really helped in 1809.
No.
And as far as I'm aware, with Sweden, it was basically, Napoleon saying, we want to get them into the continental system. Please do this for us, and we may or may not give you some support.
Which is just classic Napoleon. He's like, do what I say, and I might help you out later on.
And I think he also offered some support with the Ottomans, which did not materialize. I think there's some sort of grand
didn't he offer to be a mediator or something with the Ottomans, or something ridiculous like that?
Something along those lines, yes.
It was, I think, it's in Zamoyski's book that Napoleon considered agreeing to let Alexander take Constantinople, or something like that.
Agreeing to the Russians taking Constantinople. I mean, that's The Russians had a commitment from an ally that they could have Constantinople on at least 3 occasions, and it never materialized.
No.
Yeah, and to be fair, I don't think it would have been a good thing had Constantinople been absorbed into the Russian Empire. I think there would have been problems.
I think so. I think the Crimean War might have started much earlier, anyway. So yeah, that sort of covers the high points without being too detailed. I think of the reasons why Russia and France ended up fighting each other, and obviously one of them as well, I guess, was just quite apart from Napoleon's terrible foreign policy, was the breakdown of his approach to marrying. Who was it he was trying to marry?
One of two. It was either Catherine, the one who would have really hated him.
Yeah.
And I think the younger one was Anna, who ended up becoming Queen of the Netherlands.
Yeah, the dowager married her off really fast when Napoleon started.
Yes, yes. But I mean, I find that sort of a rather spurious claim. I mean, maybe there would have been, some effect, but it was never going to happen.
No.
Because the Russians did not want it to happen. To think that the Russians felt sort of somewhat felt insulted when Napoleon went to marry Marie Louise, I think, more relief than anything else.
I think so too, but it obviously was never going to happen, and everybody in St. Petersburg was just sort of like, well, nobody saw that coming. But in terms of PR and political clout, they could claim indignity that you have shunned a member of my family. So you could score really easily off that.
That's what everyone was doing in Europe at this time. The Russians were certainly very good at that game.
So that brings us on to my next series of notes. A lot of people talk about the massive size of Napoleon's army. I'm kind of interested in the Russian army at the time, because obviously it's been a long time since Austerlitz, and Friedland, but more especially Eylau, and I never know if I'm pronouncing that properly.
Eylau, I think that's right. Yeah.
And I wanted to ask or discuss that change. What happened that makes that earlier Russian army different to the one that had to face the massive Grande Armée?
Firstly, the Russians didn't do that awfully in 1807, it has to be said.
I agree.
They fought Napoleon to a standstill in Eylau, and then Friedland, was a bit of a disaster.
It was an embarrassment comparatively.
The fault is at Bennigsen's door, as many faults tend to be. Yes. Let's give him that. Let's credit him with that. But I think the changes you had, the army and the command structure was far more rationalized, and you had sort of more junior officers being able to take greater initiative, which the Russians like doing a lot. Usually rather foolhardy, and sometimes you survive, but sometimes
it's not a big deal if you don't.
Worth the sacrifice. Die for the fatherland. Get your name mentioned in songs and poems and stuff. That's always the Russians, the Russian officer's dream anyway. Sort of general changes in organization and doctrine, and also some of those maneuvers that Barclay had to do in 1812. You can't do that with like an army that you just picked off the ground. The complex maneuvers involved in having a rear guard, which is keeping the enemy at bay, and then allowing the rest of your army to retreat in good order, not to go down the wrong roads and get lost. Obviously, stuff did get confused because this was the Russian army and it was 1812, and the generals hated each other's guts. For all that Barclay did to sort of smooth the command structure, and he did a lot, the fact is that you had people with massive egos around. The fact that Alexander did not say, you are the commander-in-chief now, was a problem.
It took ages to do that as well. It was pretty much when nobody else was around. Bagration was dead. That he finally kind of gave Kutuzov...
No, Kutuzov was around before Bagration was dead, but...
I know, but I just got the feeling in a way that he only became supreme commander when the First Army was amalgamated into the
all the staff and everything. Barclay got really annoyed by that. And this is the sort of hilarious thing, it's not as though Bagration was Russian either.
I know. I was reading it earlier in the week, and you're reading War and Peace and all this rot about the German generals and stuff. Right. And I'm thinking he's more Russian than Bagration is.
Bagration's grandfather was Muslim.
I thought it was hilarious when I thought about how the Soviets thought that he was like the proper Russian general, son of the soil sort of thing.
He was a bloody prince, for God's sake. Kutuzov and Bagration, who the Soviets adored, both nobility. One a prince to begin his life. Barclay, minor nobility, but still fairly mediocre background. And ended up Field Marshal Prince Barclay de Tolly, great number of victories to his name, massive haul of medals and stuff. I don't think it's really about nationality as much as it is about essentially the spirit. Because on the one hand, you had Barclay and Bagration on both sides of the debate, both non-Russians. But I mean, there's this great quote. Basically, Yermolov, this was not too long after Smolensk, I think, and he was at headquarters, and Barclay and Bagration were basically each other and say, you're a German traitor and coward. And Barclay saying, you're not Russian and you don't even know why you call yourself one, and all of that. And then Yermolov was basically just standing around being really awkward. And then whenever anyone sort of approached wanting to talk to either of them, he basically said, the commanders are very busy talking strategy at the time and do not want to be disturbed.
Like something out of the death of Stalin.
Exactly.
There should so be a movie in those terms about 1812 or something like that.
Drama in the Russian headquarters. You could clearly make a brilliant comedy out of it, I'm sure.
Absolutely.
General Neverovsky, the commander of 27th Division. So I think he was on the leftmost flank. There's one account by Paskevich which says leading his men into a counterattack on his horse, and then he sort of raised high his saber and sort of shouted, "Rebyata, guys, lads!" And then he was about to sort of finish his command when his horse, I believe, was struck by a cannonball or winded or something. And he fell off his horse. It wasn't a direct hit. I think it sort of landed near it, but the impact basically took him off his horse. And then his attendants basically helped him back on. And he just continued riding forward and finished his command. Carry on forwards. And
is that dark sort of comedy that we were just talking about? You would absolutely write it that way, that he goes forward and does this and gets thrown off his horse, and then he like would order the troops to just stop a minute.
Stop a minute, wait until I get back on.
I think Barclay had some of the best sort of comebacks in the story, to be honest. Because he was much calmer than the other ones for some reason. The showdown with Bagration and Grand Duke Constantine, where he gets just this barrage of hate at Smolensk, and he's just like, "You do your duty and allow me to do mine," and then he sends
it back to Petersburg with an important message for your brother. I mean, like that takes balls,
It's like the Tsar's brother.
Sure, you're Minister of War. Sure, you're the commander of this large army. Sure, the Tsar basically entrusted this army to you, and the Tsar is a very good friend of yours. But at the same time, you're still sending his brother home. For insubordination.
Commander of the Imperial Guard.
And that's what I love, because some accounts of Borodino have Constantine commanding the guards. There's no way.
No,
but no. But obviously, that's the sort of post hoc. We don't want to admit that Grand Duke Constantine, pissed off Barclay so badly that he had to get sent home. like a naughty schoolboy.
Indeed, it's brilliant thing. I could see it in my head.
It's absolutely wonderful. And Björnson also got sent home, but Björnson later came back because essentially he'd been appointed chief of staff, and I think he. I'm not exactly sure what happened. I've read different accounts which sort of say different things, but I think my favourite account is they were travelling in different directions and sort of bumped into each other. Kutuzov said, yes, you've actually been appointed chief of staff?
Why don't you just come with me?
So, yeah. But with the sort of nationalities thing, because Barclay and Bennigsen did not get on, and at the Council of Filí, the people who took the opposing sides were Bennigsen saying, we need to defend this position, to the death, defend the walls of Moscow, and if we can't defend the position, then let's do a preemptive attack. And then Barclay was the one saying, this is completely ridiculous. You're basically burying the army on the river Moskva. When I've been in Russia, I'm not exactly sure what the position was, because obviously, Moscow has changed considerably since then. Yeah. But if it's what I think the position is, and I imagine it would have probably been more wooded back then than it is now, then I'm just thinking, what sort of idiot would fight a battle here?
He got lucky. To an extent, he got lucky at Eylau, a snowstorm and everything, allowing him to just rip apart an entire corps. But that doesn't mean you can just pick your spot and he'll be obliging enough to do the same thing.
Relying on the elements is not a sort of way of winning consistent battles.
No.
But as we talked about on the nationality issue, both Barclay and Bennigsen were German. Bennigsen was actually German. He was Hanoverian.
Well, Barclay had German extraction, but I think he was probably one of the more Russian generals.
Yes, sort of Russian by kind of blood and by allegiance, but not Russian by the Russian standard of Russian.
Yeah. In 1812, there arose up a need to be very Russian.
Very Suvorovian,
Yeah.
Just punch of the bayonet.
And that worked for him. What did he say? I have his quote here when he was talking to when he captured General Serurier. And he said, well, what do you expect? We're Russians. We understand nothing. We are without rules and without tactics. And that is just.
Oh, I'm sure we have much more to talk about Suvorov, but I mean.
Oh, we should. Yes, actually,
he's just such. I mean, he is the definition of chaotic good. The guy was completely mental.
Mental. If we take this turn under Suvorov, we will never get off this. But we can say it, because one of the things about the Russian army of 1805 was that it was very much Suvorov's army and very much almost Peter the Great's army still. Those two things dominated its makeup, essentially.
Yes, although to be fair, having Kutuzov in command of the strategy until the night before Austerlitz,
was not helpful. But in spirit, I think it was. Yeah. It was very much still that army, which got broken at Austerlitz, essentially.
To be fair, I think it was the same spirit in 1812, and
true, yeah.
The Russians were defending for most of 1812, or at least the French advance. But even during their defense, there was a bunch of counterattacking, and I think that's just the way the Russians do things. Yeah, as I say, you come at us with a column, we'll come at you with our own column.
Exactly.
What is this line nonsense?
Rubbish. Took them until 1813 to get a decent Jager corps.
I mean, I think the light infantry did improve, and I think in 1812 it was already beginning to show its.
And that's an important thing as well, because you were talking about the reforms of Barclay, and one of the problems is that he had only just finished it.
Yeah.
And basically, when you just finish it, you don't have time for it to work and people to get used to it. You think about it, everybody bangs on about Napoleon's stuff, and everybody bangs on about the Prussian stuff. But the Prussians had years to work out why they got it wrong at Jena, and Napoleon stuff is sort of birthed in the Channel camps, essentially, at the beginning of the Napoleonic Wars. With that said, Michael Broers makes the argument, based roughly on the state of the Russian army in 1807, that it was the equal man for man, battalion for battalion, a Russian battalion vis a French battalion. There wasn't much between them, to be honest.
Yeah, I would generally agree. I think the men were always certainly very brave, very tenacious.
They were excellent 19th century infantrymen, because you could tell them to do something and they would just do it.
Because most of them were peasants.
Yeah.
And serfs. And essentially, what else have they got to do with their life? Because when a lot of and I did some research on this for my MPhil dissertation around the sides. When you're a Russian soldier, if you once you get conscripted, you're unlikely to see your family again.
Yeah.
But if you do, they don't welcome you back, because it's another mouth to feed, and you're probably wounded and maimed.
There's no help whatsoever. You get 25 years service in the Russian army, and that's almost, for life expectancy. I don't know what life expectancy was for serfs, but it's probably not much more than that.
I mean, it's true. Very few, I think, managed to serve their entire 25 years.
There is a few exceptions. One, Vasily Kostyakov, the oldest veteran. There's a photograph of him sitting on a gun barrel with one leg and things like that.
Yes.
He didn't go home or anything like that. He went somewhere else.
you just sort of like become sort of a wandering nomad and try your best to sort of live off the land and sort of find something useful to do with your life, because you have no idea how to even go home. Especially if you're sort of a Russian serf, you're not going to have a map or anything. No. If you did, and given the fact that so many Russian villages have the same names, the life of a Russian soldier was not particularly pleasant.
No.
Yeah, unlike the French, who could actually sort of go back to some sort of normal civil life. I think.
Yeah, but Michael Broers said that helped the toughness of the Russian army and its esprit de corps, because you didn't have anywhere else to go. This was your new place. It was your new home. Yeah, it's your home now. And you knew everybody else was in the same boat.
You start getting sort of people talking, soldiers referring to each other as brothers and stuff, because that's essentially. And again, I looked into this for my research. A lot of Russian songs of this period, especially written by people at the front, is all about sort of brothers and fathers. When it comes to the glorious generals of yesteryear, the grandfathers. Yeah. This magnificent Russian song, which I don't think is contemporary to 1812, unfortunately, which is why I didn't write about it in my dissertation. But it's called Soldatushki Bravi Rybyatushki, or Soldiers, Brave Lads. Soldiers, brave lads, who are our fathers? Our fathers are Russian commanders. Soldiers, brave lads, who are our mothers? Our mothers are our white army tents. And who are our wives? They are our sidearms, and so on and so forth. And then in the end, who are our grandfathers? Our grandfathers are our glorious victories.
It gives you a brilliant little picture of what we've just been talking about in miniature there. Because what's interesting as well is that we've talked about Bagration a little and Barclay, and Kutuzov is the one we haven't quite talked about yet. And what he
died 207 years ago today.
Yes, did it? Oh yes, he did. Wow, yes. I didn't even register that properly when I saw it earlier, but yes. It's the anniversary of his death. Hurrah! And he strikes me as a very 18th century general. He's one of those diplomat generals in a way. Although he did amazingly get hit in the head by a bullet twice and survived. And I always
should have died both times.
I know. I always say, if there's one man who's going to beat Napoleon, it's going to be the guy who took a bullet to the head twice and just said, "I will not die."
that's basically what he sort of. What he thought himself. I've had these 2 terrible head injuries, and I'm still alive. Clearly, fate has preserved me for something much greater. And
in the great tradition of 18th century generals, he was a very popular general. He knew how to get into the hearts of his soldiers. He called them his boys and his children, which is what they used to do. It's a Teutonic. Lots of Frederick the Great did it, and that sparked a German kind of tradition of my boys, my children, and they in return called him Papa or Batyushka.
Batyushka.
Yeah, that was his strength. That was the reason he could stay in command, because the soldiers loved him.
Well, exactly. Kutuzov, old, fat, lazy, sleeping around everywhere. Yeah. The Tsar hated him. He's essentially a cat, which is why we've called him Kutuzov.
Blamed him for Austerlitz rather unfairly.
Yeah, Kutuzov in 1812. He couldn't get on a horse without support.
Yep.
The reason why he was there was basically, because it was this embodiment of the Russian military spirit. And it was massive for morale terms. And I think certainly if Wellington said that Napoleon was worth sort of 40,000 men on the battlefield, I think Kutuzov is probably worth 20 or 30.
You could do a great t-shirt or mug with the hats of each general and the amount of men that each one is worth.
Some sort of bar chart.
Yeah. Some little white round hat.
Yes, white with the visor.
That brings us nicely on to the battles.